Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Alyssa Young, and I am the audience and events producer at the Bangor Daily News. Thank you for coming tonight. For those of you in the audience who are subscribers, thank you so much for your support. For those of you joining us for the first time, please, who may please consider please consider purchasing a subscription to the Bangor Daily News. We'd like to thank our Broadband in Maine series sponsors, GWI, Island Institute, and AARP Maine, as well as our tourmaline sponsor for this event, Harbor Pilgrim Healthcare. As a reminder, this event is being recorded. Our host tonight is BDN Managing Editor, Dan MacLeod. He's an Orland native who moved to Portland in 2002 and now lives in Unity. He's been a journalist since 2008 and previously worked for the New York Post and the Brooklyn paper. Also joining us tonight is Peggy Schaffer. She's the Executive Director of the ConnectME Authority, Maine's program to expand broadband to unserved areas of the state. Prior to joining ConnectME, Peggy was the Small Business Advocate in the Secretary of State's office and served as the co-chair for the Maine Broadband Coalition, a statewide advocacy organization that is focused on expanding high-speed broadband. Peggy also served as the Chief of Staff in the Maine State Senate and worked as the lobbyist for the Department of Economic and Community Development under both King and Baldacci. Peggy lives in Vassalboro. Anna Reed is joining us from Pew Research Center. She leads Pew's efforts to examine how the federal government and states are working to connect millions of Americans to high-speed, reliable internet as part of the Trust's Broadband Access Initiative. Her work focuses on research and promising practices that will help legislators and other policymakers expand connectivity and close the digital divide. Before joining Pew, Anna was a senior research associate at the American Planning Association. She also worked as a project manager on regional broadband planning efforts for Missouri's Office of Administration and for the International City County Management Association. Her work there focused on smart growth and rural communities. She holds a bachelor's degree from Bryn Mawr College and a master's in regional planning from Cornell University. And also joining us tonight is Mike Butera. Dr. Mike Butera is a resident of Swan's Island and the CEO of Artiphone, a music technology startup. After transitioning from lifelong summer person to full-time Mainer last year, he runs his Nashville-based company remotely from the island. Mike also holds a PhD in sound and technology studies from Virginia Tech and was a professor of sociology and philosophy. He's toured the country as a multi-instrumental musician. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I really appreciate you being here, and I will pass this along to Dan to get our discussion started.
Great, thanks so much. So we're going to have a conversation, and then I think we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. So feel free to, I guess Alyssa will prompt you when that's time. I guess let's start with Mike. Can we talk a little bit about the motivation for communities and individuals who want broadband access? Like, what are the impacts right now on daily life?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here. Thanks for having us. I've been thinking about this a lot, having moved from Nashville to Swan's Island was a big shift, and broadband access was certainly one of the top things on my mind. For me, it's a balance personally, between personal activities, whether it's browsing the internet, streaming video, calling friends on phone or video, and then also running a business remotely, which for me basically involves pretty nonstop video calls, just like this, with people around the world. And so, for that, I know for other people could be gaming or high-speed data transfers or, all kinds of stuff. But I think what I've found is what's really needed is not only speed, but, stability and reliability, and across all those things, even if you're just browsing the internet. But of course, if you're, say, doing a family video call over the holidays, you want a stable connection and one where you can actually see and hear everyone around you. For me in business, it's just really important that we don't miss words or sentences when we're talking to each other. So that's actually been one of the biggest things on my mind this year, is the the reliability of the connection in addition to the speed. So that's a preview at least.
Peggy, what about you? What have you seen from communities and people who are who want broadband access? What is the motivation?
Well, I think one of the key, the pandemic has really sort of highlighted this more than in times past, and certainly in the past year, the places that what we have seen huge increase in demand on is education, whether that's K through 12 or colleges. Kids have been home and they needed a solid connection. And what we actually found this year was that not only were kids home, but multiple kids were home Zooming and parents were home. And so the reliability and the quality of that connection became even more important to families. The other thing that has happened, telemedicine has long had great promise, but nobody really bought into it, right? The doctors didn't really like it. Patients want to see their doctor. That has completely changed in this past year. People have become to use it out of necessity and now have grown to like it. And so the patient monitoring, the contact with your doctor, all of those kinds of things have driven that use. And I think to me, the other piece that's really changed is civic engagement. I can use our board as an example. We have met monthly for 6 years, well, probably more like 12 years. And we have essentially the same 6 people that come to every meeting. We call them the usual suspects, very lovingly. But since the pandemic, we now, because we're all online, we now have 60 and 70 people coming to our meetings. And I think that is true across the spectrum. Town selectmen have more people coming to their meetings. School boards have more people coming to their meetings. So the civic engagement that broadband enables has been significant, and it's been a huge shift and a good shift. And so I think people are looking for a better connection, not just speed, but as Michael pointed out, latency and quality and consistency, more so now than they did a year ago.
Thanks. Anna, can you talk a little bit about how communities have been managing without broadband access?
Yeah, as Peggy mentioned, the pandemic has really drawn a lot of attention to the need for broadband in communities where there's a lack, over the last year in communities that have lacked access. There's been a lot of focus on those sort of gap solutions or short-term solutions, such as hotspots or public Wi-Fi access points that get people online immediately, but maybe don't fully meet that need of connecting a household over the long term. And so that's been, really one of the trends throughout the pandemic in communities that don't have broadband access is that there have been, a lot of efforts to provide those temporary connections, and now an increased emphasis or focus on the need for those long-term solutions.
Thanks. Mike, what about you? I think you have like a whole combination of various sources for your internet, right? How are you getting by? And what's going on the island?
I'll give a hint to the patchwork I'm working with right now. So from Swan's Island, I did sign up for Starlink a few months ago and have been using it every day. It works really well for basic browsing and things like streaming a movie, but it doesn't work currently for reliable video connections because there are dropouts in the beta program. And so I actually have both Starlink connected and a hotspot going on my phone that is that's bonded together with a piece of software called Speedify, so that there's a redundant streams happening on each service, so that hopefully, we'll see, hopefully you don't get any dropped frames here. But that's how I've been getting by, because at this point our DSL provider TDS is not sufficient for video calls, and so we canceled that, and now I've got this moving, but it works for now.
Peggy, are there any others you've seen?
No, I think that's, people have been using hotspots. They're sort of a lifeboat solution, right? A lot. So people have they used a cellular hotspot on their phone that then operates their computer. The problem with most of your hotspots is they have a data cap, right? And so it's difficult for families who have a lot of people using it because you use up that data cap pretty quickly and it becomes pretty expensive. So between the public spots where people can sit in the library parking lot or McDonald's to use that Wi-Fi, the schools have turned most of the schools have turned their network so you can get them out in the parking lot now. Those are all sort of the intermediate options. Some areas, Brunswick, I believe, did with the Wi-Fi on a bus, which essentially means they have a school bus that's Wi-Fi enabled and they park it somewhere so people can go sit near the bus. But all of that sort of involves people working and learning from their car, which is, not optimal ever, and certainly not optimal in winter.
So Peggy, voters approved a $15 million bond last year. Can you talk a little bit about the resources that are currently available to communities or individuals that aren't included in this bond right now?
Yes, so the $15 million bond, we have the first, we call them rounds, open right now for about half of that bond. The provider expansion projects, which are projects for providers, internet service providers, to bring out their service to a little larger footprint, right? So those were due about 2 weeks ago, and community projects, which are usually trying to be close to a universal build for a community, are due, I think, on Wednesday or Tuesday. We will have a second half of that bond going out in August. Other resources that are currently available really involve working directly with a provider, which you have to, there are grants too, and figuring out whether the provider can pay for the expansion in your community, or whether your community can use part of its property tax base, or various other options like a revenue bond or general obligation bond to help that provider expand service. So those are sort of some of the options that people are looking at. The Down East Broadband Utility, which is up in Calais, did this a couple years ago. They essentially went to a bank and got a loan using the Community Reinvestment Act. So they got a 2% loan, which was guaranteed by the town. So the towns have put up funding that if they don't have a revenue stream to pay that bond off, then the town money comes in to help pay off that revenue stream. And they've expanded broadband that way using a utility district model, which is not like water and sewer, with a revenue stream from the subscribers that helps pay off the loan that they took out to build the network. The nice thing about broadband is that it's a 20-year asset, so communities can actually can use a 20-year loan or 20-year bond to pay for it, which lowers the cost sort of overall. And a lot of times when communities begin to do this, they look at when you think about replacing the dish TV and the cable, and it ends up that it doesn't actually cost the people in town anymore to have a high quality network. So those are some of the ways the towns are beginning to look at alternate funding. We do provide grants to communities to think about how this, we call them community planning grants. We do them, Island Institute does some, Maine Community Foundation does some. We, to help communities figure out what are the strategies, what is it they want, and what are the strategies they need to get to that point going forward, the kind of money they need, what's the feasibility study, where's served, where's unserved, all those kinds of questions. And we actually, I think next week we'll be opening our second round or first round, depending on how you look at the fiscal year, of grants for those kind of community planning activities. So that's what's available right now. There is potentially more money coming from the feds. The American Rescue Plan included money for counties and towns. Broadband is one of the options. So those are potentials for towns and communities to have to help build out a network. There's also going to be funding for the state coming through the Treasury. We don't know the structure of any of those funds yet because they have about 60 days to the feds have about 60 days to figure that out. And that 60 days ends in mid-May. So that's what we're looking at sort of right now. There's some resources available. There will be more soon. So why it's really important for people to get themselves organized and get themselves focused on what they want to do in their community and who their partner is going to be, whether it's a private partner or funding. How's that all going to work?
Thanks. Actually, one more question for you. Where in Maine have you seen the biggest gaps in connectivity?
Where the density and the distance is great, right? So right now, Outer Waldo County has very poor connectivity. Piscataquis County has among the worst connectivity. It's not very great in Northern Franklin or Oxford, just sort of rural Washington County. It's just about anywhere where you have a low density, a low number of people per mile, that connectivity is just not great. We had, we built out this broadband network on DSL, which was a phone service, right? And they figured out how to tweak it to make it work for broadband, and it has worked somewhat for a while. But now that we have increased demand for video and other things, the DSL network, on top of being older, right, and which copper degrades over time, is just not meeting the demands of today. So there are people across the state who have some level of connectivity, right, just enough to make you frustrated, but not really the high quality service that they need for this century.
Yeah, no, I feel you. I live in Outer Waldo County, and I'm surprised that actually I've kept Zoom running this long. Mike, what do you think are some of the best options for certain areas in Maine?
Well, I think it depends on obviously your use case, and I'm really curious if people in the audience have other use cases we haven't mentioned. But if you are really just browsing the internet, a lot of the times, and I don't know if we want to get into any like definitions in this, but what is broadband? What are we really aiming toward? The sort of gigabit access level is way more than most people need. But I don't know, Dan, what your upload and download speeds are like, but I know here the DSL speeds, the upload is often much less than a megabit per second, which is barely enough for audio these days, and video, it doesn't quite work. But if that's not really your goal, if you're not doing video conferencing all day, even a DSL connection, I think for most casual users would be fine. Once if you're on the mainland and you can get cable and all that usually works. Most people don't think about it too much, but it is, in these rural areas where that direct line doesn't work. I honestly, personally, I'm optimistic about Starlink, but I'm coming from sort of a power user standpoint, from business and personal. So there's an upfront cost right now, the $500 dish, and I'm in the beta program. So there's those issues. It's possible that by this summer that they're resolving those and going into the full service, but it's still going to be most likely $500 a month plus $100 fee, and that's actually not too much more than a lot of basic internet, DSL or cable, but it is, especially the upfront cost is too much, and again, it's just not reliable now. I also think that in the future, like Peggy was saying, right now hotspots have data caps. I mean, if you watch a Netflix movie, you might actually stream 5 gigabytes in a single movie, and those plans often max out at 30. So that's 6 movies a month and nothing else. It's just not really feasible. But I think there will be some pressure in the near future for service providers to offer more plans to consumers. But it is tough today if you're doing more than browsing to just be on cell service. I wish I had better answers. I mean, we can get into more details on any of that stuff. I will say I've heard that other satellite things like I guess HughesNet, and there's a couple of others, the latency, which is the time it takes from when you click to go up and back down, is way too much to be useful in sort of anything other than loading a web page. That I haven't heard anyone be able to use it for real-time communication. So Starlink is different because, and the new, it's not live yet, but the Amazon's doing it. There's a couple others coming online, but they're different because they're low orbit and the latencies are actually very low. But otherwise, satellite just hasn't been viable. Did that get to your question, Dan?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, there's a question from the audience. Someone we're hoping that you could describe Starlink a bit, the technology, the equipment, the cost, where it works and where it doesn't.
Sure.
You had mentioned that it was $500 a month. It's $500 to get in and then $100 a month, right?
Correct. Yes, $500 upfront cost. So it's a satellite dish, and they're putting up hundreds and thousands of low orbit satellites. And then this satellite dish will basically orient itself and get a good connection. And as a satellite passes over, it kind of does this mesh networking thing up there, and you get your internet back and forth. And so you order. Right now, it's in beta for the next couple months. So you'll order a satellite. You'll put it out in your yard. It has to be free of obstructions along like quite a large field of view, and so if you have enough room and you can see especially toward the north sky, it's $100 a month for up to 100 megabit download speed, so very usable for that, for raw speed, and yeah, they've been rolling it out across the country now, and they're putting new satellites up, I don't know, every week or something. So I've even noticed it's gotten better in the past couple months. But just to say kind of the detail of my connectivity experience with it, it works great as long as it's working. And so you'll get super, like more speed than you know what to do with for most of the time, except every 15 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, it'll just cut out. And so that could be a 2-second blip that in a Zoom call doesn't really matter. Certainly wouldn't matter for streaming a movie because it buffers. But oftentimes it could be a minute or two, and that'll actually cut off this call, and you'd have to log back in. And so, that's why I've gone through my whole sort of hybrid setup. But it is expected in the next couple of months that they'll have enough satellites to do full coverage. But it's a technology that's being rolled out live, which is why it's beta.
It is a beta, and I think it's going to be in beta for a while. They say they need somewhere between 4,000 and 12,000 satellites. They're making a global system, right? It's not about Maine; it's a global system. And they say they need somewhere between 4,000 and 12,000 satellites to do really what they want to do. Some estimates are higher. And right now they have about 1,200 up. They are launching about 160 a month. If they have a big thing that they're trying to launch, and so far they've done it twice and it's burned up on the launch pad. That can launch a lot more satellites, but that's not ready yet. The important piece here is it is a beta test, which is why you have the skips, which is why you have, and they are also, I mean, there's a long waiting list for Starlink, and they are intentionally picking where they want to go. And part of that is because for them, it's a learning process, right? They want to know the extent of where they're going to go. They want to know what works. They want to know what doesn't, so they can learn from so it's not necessarily commercially available. I actually think that people on Swans, we have about 20 or so people out there with it. And they've said, we got enough people on Swans Island, we're going to go someplace else. And that's the nature of the beta, right? It's just the nature of their test. They're trying to figure out how to make this network work. So that's the pluses and minuses sort of it. It is not inexpensive, right? It's $100 a month. There is no data caps right now. They say they're not going that way. And so there's still a lot of unknowns about this technology, but for people like Michael and I have it in my house in Lubec, we have no other options. And, you believe me, when you don't have internet, you learn these things. You just live with the things, right? You live getting bumped off Zoom, you live with it, but it's not ideal right now. So.
Yeah. Anna, can you speak generally about the arguments for and against satellite as a reasonable solution for communities for whom maybe laying fiber isn't an option?
Sure. So Mike touched on a few of them, but with the sort of existing the high Earth orbit satellites, you have challenges related to both the speed and the latency of that service, which can make it fairly difficult to use. They tend to be relatively expensive, and there are also often data caps. When you're looking at the low Earth orbit satellites, as has been mentioned, the commercial products are still in a beta testing phase, so they may provide options that reduce some of those challenges related to latency and are able to provide higher speeds. But we'll have limitations on the number of users, which every network technology does have, but who can be using it at the same time and able to maintain some of those speeds, that are the advertised speed essentially. And then there's still the existing satellites, the higher traditional satellites are, they do provide a level of connectivity in areas where there are no other options, but it's really not comparable to what you're able to get from other technologies. And then when you're looking at the low Earth orbit satellites, they may provide a better option, but there's still a lot to be learned about that as they move into a fully commercial product.
I think Maine has been sort of in the forefront of some of these community planning activities. We haven't done a lot of the infrastructure bill because we haven't had a lot of money. This is our first tranche of money. But Anna has had great experience working with states across the country about what they're doing around how to connect these rural communities and how states are approaching this, that I think might be helpful to put context around sort of what we're trying to do here and what other states are trying to do and what are the big challenges that we're all trying to solve together. That might be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about some of the other state programs. So a number of states have grant programs of some type now to facilitate broadband deployment, particularly to rural and underserved areas, which, as Peggy noted, you tend to see service challenges where the density drops off. So that's pretty consistent across states, like what the challenge looks like geographically and what communities don't have that level of service. So states have these grant programs which have varying levels of funding, but over the last couple of years, we've seen really a significant increase in the amount of money that states are putting into those programs that provide support in those areas generally for about 50% of the grant cost. One thing that has been a trend over the last couple of years is states focusing on sort of increasing the speed standard, both for what they define as a community that lacks service, as well as the requirements for what you have to build to or what they prioritize in funding. And so there's a lot of prioritization of projects that are scalable to speeds higher than the current definition of broadband, and increasingly some emphasis on symmetrical speeds. And I think, Peggy touched on this at the outset. Over the course of the pandemic, there's been a lot more use of, working from home and learning from home and those sort of upload intensive applications. So the traditional definitions of broadband as they've evolved over time have focused on, a higher download speed than upload speed. And so just in terms of state trends generally, we're seeing kind of that increasing focus on emphasizing higher upload speeds as well, which I know you've done in Maine as well. And so I think one component that you see pretty consistently in these state programs is active engagement of smaller or non-traditional providers to support broadband. So deployment to these rural communities, whether that be, telephone cooperatives, small telephone companies, electric cooperatives in many states, which have become major participants in the state grant programs, or other smaller locally based providers, as well as an emphasis on that engagement of the community in defining the challenge and who the partner should be to solve that challenge.
Thank you. Mike, do you have a sense of what the perfect solution is for access?
Nope.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm wondering. I saw in the comments Marvin's question about especially poor and underserved rural communities in Maine, and I think that's a good it's a good question because there are just so many different use cases and people who need access for different reasons. And we've been talking about education. I used to be a sociology professor, so it's dear to my heart to figure out how to get access to everyone. And I think what Anna just brought up about upload speeds has actually been one of the biggest pain points I've felt and heard from a lot of people is if you can't, if when I used to teach in a classroom, like if a kid raised their hand, you call on them and you can hear them, and it works out. But in this case, if kids or anyone can't participate in an experience that is meant to be bidirectional, the fact is the technology to make that happen is pretty demanding. Like most basic DSL or other connectivity might not be able to handle that. So I think if you're basically, it's the simple way to put it is like if you need real time bidirectional communication with video, then that I think might be the highest thing I think on most people's list right now that they need, compared to, like Anna's saying, just download speeds to download an application or a picture or something isn't the main need right now. So yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about maybe some more specific use cases, what we can recommend to people, for most people, I think in Maine, I don't know what the percentages are, but they probably have access to, like, do the majority of people have access to cable or fiber? Is that not even the case? Peggy, you probably know.
No, it's not.
Oh, wow.
It's cable is generally, again, if you are about 20 homes per mile, that's where cable sort of stops, more or less. And then cellular also is not good in a lot of places in Maine. So the access for cellular is not great. So here's the thing for me about, because I've seen a couple of questions on affordability. So for me, this whole thing, we are trying to build a network, right? So we're all trying to get connected to this same network. And it's important as we do that we remember that we do want everyone to be connected to this network. So it really shouldn't depend on, ideally, it shouldn't depend on where you live or how much money you have or what kind of access to technology you have to have the same quality connection to this network. The economic development vehicle of this century is communication. It really is. It's for healthcare, it's for education, it's for civic engagement, it's for social engagement, it's for small businesses to get online and do stuff. All of that is going to happen over this network. And so when we think about how we do that, it's important that we think about it as a society, right? So that we make sure that we have access for everyone, that there's an equality here that raises all the boats. And some of that is around trying to make sure that everybody has the same quality connection and that they're all connected into that network. And another big piece is how we make it affordable. Right now, there's the emergency broadband benefit, which is a new federal program that came in, I believe, in December. The Federal Communications Commission is trying to figure out the rules and open up that process, but it's a benefit of about $50 per month for a family to be connected to the internet. This is the first time we've done anything like this, right? We have a Lifeline program, which is basically a telephone benefit. This is a broadband benefit. And there's also additional funding if you need a device. But the pieces around connectivity are not just whether you have a wire running by your house, but whether you can afford that wire, whether you have a device to use that wire, and whether you know how to use that wire. So it's really a four-part of it. It's the connectivity is the how, and the rest of it is the why. And so when we begin to think about how we expand broadband, it's important that we think about it as a community, right? That everyone in your community should be connected. And to some extent, that the Starlink solutions are antithetical to that because it's really one person at a time. And we don't build a network that we can jointly work on together if we solve the solution one person at a time. And so that's one of the reasons we really believe in this community planning process, because it does a couple things. It brings all the people in the community together. It identifies the issues around connectivity. It identifies the issues around affordability and need. And it also gives providers a chance to come in and say, look, there is actually enough people in this community that I can justify making an investment if I can get a little subsidy from someone, right? So that's what we have seen with this community planning process. And I think it's really important. The other thing that we are trying to figure out is how to lower the cost of the builds going in, right? This continual, like emergency broadband benefit where you pay the low income people at the end for the service doesn't really get rid of the cost all the way through the system. So we have to figure out if there are ways that we can lower the cost of actually building out and providing the internet. So scale really matters. So not one community at a time, really think about this regionally. Think about what level of public ownership can help pay for that, whether more middle mile is helpful. So there's a lot of moving parts to that, but it's just, we have to look at it from a lens of how we as a society want to make this an equitable piece, how we make sure everybody can have access to it.
Totally agree, Peggy.
Ms. Schaffer, can I ask you a question just directly? When you say that about the idea of looking at it as a community, and I apologize, I'm very late to this game. I read the Maine Bangor Daily News piece, et cetera, and I was really fascinated, which is why I jumped on board this, because like Mr. Butera, I recently came back to Maine. I was born and raised there, came back this summer, and I was kind of struck by, if you had the money, you could put in a system. If you don't have the money, you can't even get access to it, which to me seems so deeply unfair. Is there any statewide system that's being looked at, and a statewide system for the idea of not only access, but a way to build that? Are there a lot of billionaires out there that should be more than happy to be able to help with such a thing? Where's our Elon Musk for Maine?
Making his own money.
Yeah.
So
Building Starlink.
building Starlink to make his own money.
Exactly.
And launch to Mars. So there are lots of options for communities to do this, right? One of Maine's significant economic development challenges is that we don't work together that well as towns, right? So it's really, I have for a while, when I first got in this, thought broadband was going to be the secret sauce to get these towns to really join in. Not so much. But one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to incentivize those kind of regional plans, larger than your community plans. This is also an unregulated industry, right? There's no regulatory structure around whether you have broadband, what kind of broadband you have, or whether you even need to have broadband. And so we're operating in a universe that has been all essentially a private network, privately owned networks, who have a stake in this, right? And so we're trying to create those partnerships between the community and those privately owned networks so that there's benefit on both sides. And that's, for me, that's led by the community planning process. It's also led by state funding to help build out in areas where the provider really can't build. And actually, helping some of these providers improve their existing network. So, they have a DSL network because that was the technology that was there when they built these networks. And now they want to switch over to fiber because their DSL is old and it doesn't meet their customers' needs. But the problem for them is that they don't get new customers for that, right? They still have you as a customer. You're still paying your $60, $70 a month, but now they're bringing in a brand new kind of technology and a new capital investment. So trying to figure out how to help those companies that do exist all over Maine expand and grow their footprint as well as improve their existing footprint. It's a bit of a puzzle, but it really takes these partnerships between communities, the state, the feds, and the private providers to get this done. And it's, I don't know that there's one right answer, but I think to me, the right answer is we have to do it together.
Great, thank you. A reminder, if anyone has any questions, just throw them in the chat. We're going to open it up in just a few minutes. Anna, I was wondering, can you talk about in other markets, is there like an average consumer pricing benefit of each additional competitor? Like, will better satellite options lower prices of other products?
So after seeing this question, I did a review again of some of the literature that's out there, and there's very little literature on the impacts of new entrants on pricing for broadband. In part because pricing data isn't all that transparent, so it can be difficult to get that data to do that analysis. and also in part because there aren't a lot of particularly competitive markets in the country. You know, you often have a cable provider and a DSL provider. Sometimes you may have a cable overbuilder as well, or a fixed wireless provider, but you often, there are very few markets that have large numbers of new entrants that impact price. So there's one study that I found from the Fiber to the Home Council, and it found a fairly significant impact on price if you're looking at the gigabit or multi-gigabit tier of pricing, which is an area where you see even less competition between providers, but about $1.50 a month for other markets or technologies. And so, you know, it's pretty difficult to make an assessment. You know, theoretically, a competitor would have an impact on price, but they're also, you know, with any broadband technology, you know, whether it's the technology is equivalent to the existing technology, how it impacts, you know, how other providers like adjust their own service offerings to the new entrant in a way that may have more of an impact on service quality than price. So I think, you know, the answer there is again, it's kind of still to be seen what that impact will be.
Gotcha. Peggy, do you have a sense of whether the CMP corridor is going to affect broadband access, like in terms of connectivity to the poles?
So the CMP corridor is actually going to bring so there's a term, we call it middle mile, right? And what middle mile is essentially a transport mile. So there's not necessarily a last mile connection on it. So the 3-ring binder, which some of you may have heard about, it was built with America in 2012 with ARRA money. And it's a very big middle mile that runs up Route 1 all the way up to Fort Kent, down Route 11. It takes a couple loops around the Bangor area. It comes out through Farmington and Rumford and then back down. That is a middle mile that provides access for last mile. And so that's what the CMP.
You want to back up and explain what you mean by middle mile and last mile?
So last mile is the fiber or connection that brings it to your door, right? So that is the customer connection. It's usually not a mile; it's usually like 10 miles, but it's the last piece that actually brings it out to the customer. The middle mile is the mile that moves all of that data around and connects to the big internet, whether it's in Canada or in Boston. But that's sort of the middle mile. So there's not really a consumer application. You can't go out and plug into the middle mile, right? You just can't. It's like a CMP line. You can't go out and plug into the line. You gotta have a transformer, and that's sort of the last mile is sort of the transformer. So the middle mile is the big piece that allows you to have those last mile connections. So the CMP corridor is they need broadband to monitor that corridor. Electricity needs broadband now to monitor what they're doing. And so rather than run just 1 or 2 strands, they're going to run 72 strands that will bring that middle mile connection to actually 2 places of the state where we do not have it, which is along the 201 corridor between Skowhegan and Jackman. And also the other one is between Wiscasset and Windsor, which is another area we don't have great middle mile. And so there's going to be a better middle mile there, which should make the last mile easier to connect to and cheaper for the towns who can feed off of that middle mile connection.
I
So
would.
the other thing that the CMP corridor is doing is there is I believe it's $10 million overtime broadband benefit for what they call the impacted community. So essentially Somerset County and a little bit of Franklin County, those communities have access to a fund to help them use that middle mile to bring out last mile connections.
I was just going to note, Virginia had a pilot program over the last 2 years focused on partnering with their investor-owned utilities to extend middle mile service into particularly rural and unserved communities in the state as part of their grid modernization efforts. And they've seen a lot of success with that program and attracting providers to those communities that, again, were particularly difficult to serve. And both of their major utilities are participating in it, and they've made it permanent as of this legislative session. So it's been a model that in the state that has been kind of actively engaged in that over the last couple of years. That's been successful in addressing both the middle mile challenge and the last mile connections in some of those communities.
I know we've been zooming all around between the present and the future, and actually there was a good question about the past with the electrification program. You know, what 80, 90 years ago, but I wonder, like, based on people on the call who are thinking, today I need, or a family or friend needs internet, and what are the options today versus like what's on the horizon, what can we do about it, how can we become active in our communities, or with our state or federal options. I don't know quite where to go with this comment, but I would imagine some people are looking for immediate answers, and others are looking for what to look forward to or how they can get involved. So even just as a summary, I wonder if we want to talk about that.
So that's what I refer to often as lifeboat solutions, right? It's enough to get you to somebody comes and rescues you. And those are things like higher satellites, Starlink, if you start with those. It can be cell connections. Those are the kinds of things, if you can get them, because there are a lot of places where cell service doesn't work, that can provide those sort of lifeboat activities. And that's also where sort of these community hotspots have come in place. Schools passed out hotspots like right and left with coronavirus relief money. And so that was a way to get students who didn't have a connectivity, whether it was because they didn't have access to it or whether they couldn't afford it. It gave them access to the internet from home with these Wi-Fi hotspots. So that is one sort of lifeboat solution that communities have used, but it really is a lifeboat solution.
And I guess touching on the parallels with rural electrification, that comes up a lot as a similar challenge. And, there are a lot of similarities in terms of both how large power companies work to protect service territories or potential territories where there would be growth at the time, and, where there wasn't service and where that was really fundamental to getting that service. And the Rural Electrification Act provided low interest loans to the rural electric cooperatives to support broadband, the deployment of electricity at the time. And states had to pass legislation to allow the formation of cooperatives. And so you see some very clear parallels there as well. But I think one of the most interesting ones to where we are in the broadband discussion now is that community engagement and the community-based provider of electricity becoming a core part of that solution. And you see a lot of movement in that direction in this space too, both with what Peggy's been talking about the community planning and engagement process in Maine. And then also in some of the things like, you talked about the Down East regional broadband utilities, so the regional utility districts, or like in Vermont, the communications union district models that are those more community-based or almost cooperative models of broadband providers, but not being provided by like a traditional electric cooperative, which is also, something that's been a major transition in the broadband provision space over the last few years.
And I might be the only panelist who can express an actual personal opinion here, given I don't have any other affiliations on the call. I don't know, but but I do think that the parallel with electricity is is a really valuable one when we look at what electrification did, obviously, for the country and for our productivity overall. I think it's undeniable that it propelled America into a new age, and a very fortunate one in the last century. I am certainly not alone to say that internet is the new electricity. People have been saying this for a couple decades now. But it really does feel to me like this is something we need to prioritize. We've been saying it, and it might be totally obvious now, but in a way that that we don't see it as an option for people who can afford it to have, but we see it as a necessity for
Is that him?
Yes, I
Ah,
believe.
okay.
And there you have one of the problems of being a beta tester on
All right, hopefully Mike will unfreeze and rejoin us. It's 10 of, so I'm going to start shifting over to some audience questions. And the first one is, we would love to hear perspectives on bulk purchasing from providers, for example, Spectrum. These are ways in which towns can contract directly with a provider to serve the town, and the provider completes the build out. These seem to be multi-year contracts.
Yeah, that's a new offering that Spectrum is doing. The one little detail I don't know is whether the towns are have to bill monthly or whether it's an annual billing. Essentially, the town agrees to pay for the internet service at a certain price for everyone in town who has cable, and the cable company usually agrees to, I think, do some expansion in town as a result of that. The advantage is that you potentially can offer a lower cost to consumers in town. The disadvantage is the town is actually on the hook if everybody who subscribes doesn't pay you. And so Islesboro essentially bulk, the Islesboro sends out bills to pay for it's a community-owned broadband, but they do it once a year, so they do it with their tax bill. So your town really needs to figure out whether, if this is a monthly piece, which is the question I don't know, whether you have the capacity to bill people monthly and collect those bills. So that's a piece you guys need to figure out in terms of what your capability is, and you have to understand that you would be on the hook if people don't pay. And so those are just some of the risks you have to take into consideration when you look at those kind of plans. You're essentially becoming the billing agent for Charter. And so that has pluses and minuses to it, but you should look at it, the full picture before you decide to go that route.
Actually, I think this next one is directed to you as well. That will ConnectMe Part 2 grant app be due in August, or is that just when the details are published with a later deadline? Also, will ConnectMe planning grants come out again?
Yes, we're due. I can answer that first question. We are asking the board to open a round of planning grants, I believe, at our April meeting, which is next week. Normally those applications are open for a month, and then we make a decision on them. So either, depending on how many apply, we will either make a decision at the May board meeting or the June board meeting around planning grants. So those, we hope the board votes to open those up next week. And all that information will be on our webpage. Our next round of grants, we have been talking August, and that is when we would open the round of grants. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is we want to revisit the definition of, we want to revisit how we designate unserved areas. We did that in January. We want to do that again. That has a mandatory, essentially 60-day window. So we got to build that in for a time frame. We want to learn from this round. We did a couple things different this round. We put out a two-tiered process, the provider expansion in the community. We want to learn from that and figure out how we need to tweak those applications to make them cleaner. So far, we've gotten a lot of applications that weren't quite complete, so we need to make sure that we are being a little more clear about what we're asking for. And the other big unknown is this federal money, right? If the Treasury creates a project that augments our money, but requires a match, we're going to have to really think about all of that as we get into the next round. So that's why we've been saying August. But I will say, last year when we talked about the first round, we did say we're going to do it in December, and we did it in February. So just think about that as a time frame. So for communities that are thinking about applying for the next round, it's really time to focus, right? It's really time to focus because the federal money is going to come soon. And our money is going to be available. So it's really time to focus on what is it you need, who are your partners, all of those things that you need to really get a good solid plan together to be competitive for a grant.
And I think that you touched on this a little before, but what is the difference between the Rural Electrification Program versus our current broadband issue?
So I think there are a couple differences, but I would just note that the U.S. Department of Agriculture's current broadband grant and loan programs are authorized under the Rural Electrification Act, which is just kind of shows, some of the parallels between those issues, and I think is also just worth noting in the discussion. I think one of the primary differences, and Peggy touched on this a little bit when she was talking about, the sort of evolution of telephone service to DSL technology, is that when you were looking at rural electrification, you were looking at places that had some electric service and places that had not been electrified yet. And now we're looking at places where there has been some level of some type of service provided by different types of providers and kind of using different technologies across the country. And so, with rural electrification, you couldn't really debate like what level of electricity did they have, and are they unserved, or are they underserved? Whereas that has become a really central part of the conversation around broadband and where to invest funds in upgrading or expanding broadband service.
What is is there a definitional difference between unserved and underserved? Is there a certain amount of options that would be considered?
So state programs define that differently. I'll let Peggy talk to how it's currently defined in Maine. And you see quite a range. So there are states that still define unserved as areas that don't have service at 10 megabits per second, 1 megabit per second. More states have moved to saying unserved as areas that lack service at 25 megabits per second, 3 megabits per second, so the FCC's current definition of broadband. South Dakota, for their funding program, has apparently just decided anything under 120 is unserved, and so they're really looking pretty broadly at what that is. And then several states also have that next level sort of underserved, so areas where the funding isn't necessarily prioritized, but where it can be used. And you see often a definition of 120 there. Though at least one state defines it as any area that doesn't have at least 2 providers.
So in Maine, we define it based on geography. So if you're coming in for a proposed service area that you're planning to grant, 80% of that area has to be served at under 25.3, but 20% of that area can have better service than 25.3. And some of that is, you have to go through the willies to get to the wags, and it's important we build this network to everybody. And so that's how we look at it when we look at a grant. So if you're coming in for, let's say, 100 homes, 80 of them have to have service of less than 25.3, and 20 of them can have service greater than 25.3.
Okay.
I have a question. I know we're close to time. Am I back? I think
You're back. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. That was ironic, maybe. So, on Swan's Island, we have a broadband committee. People get together and we're trying to figure this out as a community, which is great. I wonder, so other than just the commercially available options we have today, what are some ways that normal people can get involved and help this process along through organizing or writing or any other ideas? But Peggy and Anna, any recommendations for normal folks?
So the communities that have been successful and moved forward rapidly have had a champion, right? They have had somebody, hopefully more than one person, but somebody who is really avid about this and is really out there selling this, continually. And on Swan Island, not on Swan Island, on Islesboro, it was a guy named Paige Clausen, who spent about 2 years hanging out at the transfer station, hanging at the ferry station, going to sewing circles, going to book clubs, hanging out at the PTA meetings. On Cranberry Islands, they actually had a resident who had just moved there. She had 3 kids, and she worked at the library. She worked at the store on the island, and she was part of the PTA. And every conversation she ever had around in that community was about broadband. And so what ended up happening on Cranberries is, there's 60 year-round residents. They put up $1 million and built their own network out there. So that is to us, that is one of the consistencies, is to have community champions who really talk to their neighbors about how important this is It's also really important to have somebody from town government engaged, right? It's really important to keep your town government engaged because you're going to come to them for some kind of, request. So it's important to have them engaged. And then it's good to have somebody who understands a little bit about the technology, who can learn about the technology. And what we have found in Maine is that there's somebody in every community. You don't know who they are. They pop into these committees and they're an old telecom exec, or it's pretty amazing. There's one town up in that's looking at this right now who have a retired Fairpoint lineman who's working on this. So there's just people everywhere who have these skills, and it's really a matter of bringing them into your community and creating those places where communities can have that conversation.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say earlier, maybe the real point of it was that even if you have internet and it's generally working, I mean, there are other residents around us that don't, and that's what's driving me to participate in our community broadband committee. But yeah, I mean, the whole state. I think if we can think about the people, especially like the kids with education and telehealth, like we were talking about, who really need this access. This is the way the world's working now, and I don't think we can see it as a just a benefit or some optional kind of thing. I think it is much more of a utility and a necessity for basic, for the economy and people's daily lives. So yeah, it's been good learning about this process as a recent Mainer, but yeah, I've learned a lot in this call too.
So an audience question here. For those of us with a more rudimentary understanding of the issues here, could you possibly explain how Maine's poor and underserved rural communities can access the needed technology / broadband?
This is why we have a community planning process. It's why we give grants to communities to start this process, to begin this conversation in your community. You sometimes can get a provider to expand to your street, but that doesn't necessarily work for your neighbors. And so really, this is a community conversation. This is how it's working in this state. So I was working across the country, is these community conversations that are providing providers with an opportunity to come in and talk and figure out that there is an opportunity for service there. It's also a chance for the community to figure out what it is they really want and how they're going to get it.
So another question. Does anyone have any information on the rollout of the new FCC emergency broadband benefit $50 a month subsidy?
I don't have any really specific information, but the FCC has been posting updates to their website as they start to establish some of the rules around the program and how to access those funds. So that, and then the National Digital Inclusion Alliance probably have the best resources currently on how to access that benefit.
It will be. It's a benefit that's going to flow through your internet service provider. So you have to qualify, and there's a whole variety of low income programs that make you qualified: free and reduced lunch, SNAP, and there's a whole variety of them. But you have to qualify, and then it's your internet service provider is the one who gets the benefit. So you have to apply through the internet service provider to get, and then they get reimbursed for the service. So that's the overall structure. There's a lot of stuff underneath that has to gel to make it really work, but that's the original concept.
Okay. And then there's a more technical question here. My cable provider provides fast internet, but the quality is very uneven. Sometimes it is fine. The next minute it has slowed to a crawl. What are my options? Spectrum is the only option in my town.
That is one of the things about DSL and about cable is it is sort of a shared resource. It's you don't have your own fiber thing to your house. You're working with other people in your neighborhood, which is why it has up times and down times, right? And again, the way to fix that is to work in your community and talk with Spectrum to see if there's a way they can improve that service. They can at times, they can, I don't know, switch out widgets and gadgets and maybe improve the service to your area, but that's a conversation you should have with them. And if they're not able to do that, that's a conversation to start with your community about is there a way that you could help Spectrum upgrade everybody's service, or is there a way maybe you should bring in a different provider? But it's usually the existing provider is usually the least expensive way to do this.
All right, I think that is it for audience questions. I do have one more question, maybe, and I don't know who wants to take this, but what is the process like for having broadband built in a new area? And are there ceilings on the prices that are allowed?
No, it's an unregulated piece. We do look at that with grants. We do look at how much they're going to charge. It's one of the things that we look at in terms of a grant. And the providers are all over the place, right, in terms of what they charge. But they're in a range, right? It's in a range of about $40 to $70 a month. So they're in that range. What it takes to build out a network is you need to have the network designed by an engineer. If it's a new network, you need to build what they call a central office, which is essentially a brick building where all the electronics live. There's technology around GPONs and all kinds of stuff they put in to make sure that you can actually get the service to your house. They have to hang the stuff on the poles. So it's one of the big pieces in Maine is what we call an aerial state. Some states that are flatter and less like a granite outcropping in the ocean can dig and bury the lines. In Maine, we put everything on poles. And so there's a whole attachment process about finding a space on the pole to attach that wire to run it down. And then they have to do what's called a drop, which means they have to drop the service to your house. So it's pretty complicated. A build can take, we normally expect a build to take roughly a year. Some of them take longer because the pole attachment process can be kind of long. But that's about what it takes. It's a pretty complicated piece, but there's a lot of technology involved. There's a lot of labor involved, and there's different moving parts.
Okay, we've got another audience question here. If one wanted to get involved to bring the best service to the most people in all of Maine, where would you direct that person to get involved?
Well, one of the places is the Maine Broadband Coalition, and they're mainbroadbandcoalition.org. They are a statewide advocacy group. They have individual members on it. They have ISPs on it. They have public interest groups like the Maine Farmland Trust and AARP, and they work jointly really to do policy and other program activities to try to bring broadband to most people in Maine. This is a street by street battle. It really is a street by street battle because it depends on where you live. And so helping shape statewide policy, which helps those street right battles is a one good way to do it. But unless you're going to become a lineman and hang the fiber yourself, that really is the best ways to get involved at a statewide level, and then get involved at your community level.
Okay. Great. I think that's all the questions. Alyssa, you want to take it?
Sure. I thank you all so much. This is a great discussion. I don't know if you have any final words or anything that you'd like to say before we close this event tonight. No, nobody. Okay.
Just a privilege to be here. Our local broadband committee meeting started 8 minutes ago. So I'll be hopping over there and continuing the work.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again so much. This has been super informative. I will be sending a recap email to all of the registrants for tonight with links to resources that we've discussed this evening. Thank you for being here. I think that's it. I don't think there's anything else. You'll get also a video of a recording of the event as well, so you can rewatch it and look at it.
Thanks for doing this. This is a really important, as we need to begin to have more of these conversations around the state and inspire communities to really think about how they're going to do this work. And this kind of effort is really important in that. So thanks for doing this.
Absolutely. No, I mean, there's a lot more conversations that we could be having around broadband. We know that for sure. So we might be having more of these in the future for sure. But yeah, thank you all so much. And I hope you have a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.